This time on Compound Insights, we're talking about which companies have the biggest risks as the energy transition continues towards renewables and away from coal. We're talking with two professionals from Carbon Tracker, which made a huge impact with its study on stranded carbon assets. We're speaking with Kingsmill Bond, CFA, who is an energy strategist for Carbon Tracker. Before this, he spent 25 years on the sell side at Deutsche, Citi, and others. We're also talking with Mark Campanelli, founder and executive director of Carbon Tracker. Prior to forming this group, Mark had 25 years of experience in sustainable financial markets, co-founding some of the first responsible investment funds at Jupiter Asset Management and Henderson Global Investors Industry of the Future Funds. Well, so the folks over at Carbon Tracker have put together a great report entitled 2 Degrees of Separation. And I think this study is important for all of our members to read because it is a fresh look at the infrastructure investments required as things change in the future, and can give a very valuable view into the expected lifespans of those investments. So Kingsmill and Mark, either of you, could you start with the story of the carbon bubble and the stranded assets that you detail in the study, please?
Carbon Tracker was founded in 2010 by myself and Nick Robbins, and we were working in fund management for, myself, for about 20 years. And one of the things we noticed that the more we knew about climate science, paradoxically, the investment community seemed to be investing and buying into more and more fossil fuel companies. And we saw that through listings on the London Stock Exchange of large coal companies like Xstrata and similar businesses. So we thought, well, there must be something wrong with the science, and also we know there's limits to the amount of carbon dioxide that can be released to the atmosphere, and that would create a constraint to the business models of the listed coal and oil and gas companies. So what we did is we just took the top 200 listed fossil fuel businesses. We calculated how much carbon dioxide was in their reserves and then their resources, and then we compared that to the budget, or the carbon budget, to around 2 degrees. And what we discovered, well, no surprises, is there's 4 or 5 times more fossil fuels out there, and also a lot of it was owned by publicly listed companies that we could possibly burn to stay below 2 degrees. So that report was called Unburnable Carbon: Are the Financial Markets Carrying a Carbon Bubble? And it went out, and we thought, well, we published it, and job done. What we hadn't realized is that it got into the hands of quite a few interesting people. Lord Stern wrote about it in the Financial Times, and then Bill McKibben from 350.org wrote about it in Rolling Stone magazine in what became a very popular article called Global Warming's Terrifying New Math, where he talked through Carbon Tracker's findings. And then he called on the world to divest from fossil fuels, not what we'd recommended in the report, which was much more around capital markets and regulatory alignment with climate goals, but he said, no, divest. And a fossil fuel divestment campaign was launched. And what that did was cause trustees of literally hundreds and probably thousands of pension funds and little church groups and high net worths to challenge the big boys like Goldman's and UBS about their exposure to fossil fuels. And then the ripple effect happened, and the phrases stranded assets and carbon bubble became commonplace. So that helped land the idea of the carbon bubble. And then backing it up was we were asked in to present to the Financial Stability Board of the G20. I presented to some of the central bankers where we talked about stranded assets. And then a few weeks later, Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, spoke about stranded assets and unburnable carbon in a speech to the Lloyd's insurance market, and then the whole of the kind of regulatory side came in, and it led to the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. So a bit of a surprise. We weren't planning to create an NGO, but an NGO is what we are now, a research think tank. And there's now 25 of us, just a lot of us are ex-Wall Street, City of London, producing detailed analytics on the energy transition.
Well, most people do intend to start NGOs before they do that, but so that may be your record. So one of the things I thought was interesting in this report that maybe didn't get reported on completely was that you have taken a look at the number and the amount of new oil and gas projects that are globally needed, and showed that there is an excess of them that are in the ground. Could you talk a little bit about that oversupply?
Yeah, I think now the oil and gas companies, there's talk about reserves. I think what they really mean is proven reserves, P1, and then there's other types, P2, which is resources, which is oil and gas and so on that's been discovered but hasn't yet been proven. And the SEC has a definition which is, I think I forget, something like 90% likelihood of extraction at current market prices. So when oil and gas companies say, oh, none of our reserves will be stranded, they can burn it all, they mean literally they're proven reserves, which often have a short life, 5, 8, 10 years. It's what they plan to do next, and what the first carbon tracker report and subsequent ones, like 2 degrees of separation, try and do is look at all the capital expenditure of all the fossil fuel majors going ahead over the next 10, 15 years, and how that converts resources to reserves and proves them to be reserves. And it's the sanctioning process that we're concerned about. And what we're discovering in our analysis is, even still with the Paris Agreement, with these climate goals and constraints, and even though we know that a lot of what's already in the public markets can be sold or burned, you've still got a lot of companies and their shareholders backing them, sanctioning projects which take us way beyond the Paris Agreement. And our latest study that came out in the last few weeks is we've concluded there's at least $50 billion of sanctioned investment into new oil and gas exploration that's completely inconsistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement of being well below 2 degrees. And so, this continues. I think investors are waking up. It's not going as quickly as we wished, but with analysis done by my colleague Kingsmill Bond on how technologically superior developments in renewables and transportation for power and transportation is going to be taking away the market for the incumbents, and that investors will be forced to address these issues whether they like it or not.
Yeah, this is very well said. This is one of the reasons I wanted to have this podcast, is because whether you are on a pension plan board or you oversee assets for investors, these types of investments wiggle their way into all sorts of things. In the U.S., they could come in through your exposure to municipal assets, not necessarily infrastructure or your corporate side. And in the European exposure, could be through PPP, it could be through lots of things. So, Kingsmill, could you go on and characterize, in your opinion, how this unfolds and how the energy transfer risk might be viewed by investors of that ilk?
So the key change that has taken place in the last 5 years to put flesh on this argument of technology-driven change has been a very rapid fall in the price of new energy technologies, as Mark just mentioned. So I'll focus on 3 examples. They are solar, wind, and batteries. All 3 have been falling on learning curves of about 15 to 20%, which is to say their price has been falling by that amount for every time capacity has doubled. And what's happened in the case of solar and wind specifically in the last 5 years, that the price of these electricity generated by these technologies has now fallen to below the price of electricity from coal and gas in basically every major country in the world. So, from the United States to United Kingdom to France to Chile to the Middle East, you have these very, very cheap electricity being generated by these renewable energy projects. And what's happened in the electricity sector, which is, after all, 40% of global energy supply and 2/3 of the growth in supply, is now being repeated in the transportation sector as the cost of batteries falls very, very rapidly. So we're confident that that we will see prices of around $100 per kilowatt hour capacity of batteries in the early 2020s, which is a kind of pivot point for most countries outside the US, where it becomes cheaper to buy electric vehicles than it does to buy conventional vehicles. And that is already starting to drive extremely rapid growth of demand for this new technology in China, which in turn is meaning that there's a lot of commentators, a lot of forecasters out there who can see peak demand for oil also happening in the 2020s, in the same way as we saw peak demand for coal earlier in this decade.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is fascinating to me to see how many of the major automotive companies are talking about going to battery only in years that I can actually conceive of. It's not a very long term strategy now. Um, Now, one of the things that is also a function here is the distribution and the investments. And you all have done a lot to characterize the price of the investments going forward. So could you tell our listeners a little bit about that and how that might work into their investments?
So one of the greatest risks to investors is the fact that around a quarter of the equity and bond markets globally are in sectors which will be disrupted by this energy transition. And it's not, in fact, just a question of oil, coal, and gas. It's also sectors which are linked. So, for example, transportation or electricity or machinery, or indeed banks which are lending to these companies. They all face disruption by this superior, cheaper new technology. And the risk, therefore, for investors is that by continuing to hold conventional index funds, they'll be left with this kind of dead weight of sectors facing disruption and therefore poor performance. And I would stress that this is not a theoretical problem that we're talking about. In fact, we've seen it in sector after sector already, starting with European electricity, where investors lost up to 80% of their investments in the period after conventional demand peaked in Europe in 2006.
Right.
And then leading through, coal with the famous U.S. coal bust at a time when global coal demand was just 2 or 3% off its all-time high, and then leading through to the problems being faced by GE, and then the automotive sector. You just talked about how the automotive companies have decided to switch, and a lot of them have incurred as a result very significant costs, and investors have faced underperformance at a time when electric vehicles are just 2% of global sales. And we would suggest that the oil sector is now starting to price in some of these risks as investors look forward and see that a period of 150 years of growth is starting to come to an end, and there's therefore quite a lot of risk as that growth peaks and starts to decline. And that's, I would suggest, one of the reasons why you've seen the break that's taken place in the last 18 months in the oil sector between the performance of the stocks and the oil price, which always used to be a very close link, and has now broken down because people don't believe in the old narrative of ever rising demand. So I guess the point is that for investors, they need to be cognizant that this energy transition will impact them, even if they don't believe in global warming, even if they don't believe in energy transition. There's enough other people who do to mean that you're going to lose money, and actually those who we would suggest that those who for ideological or personal reasons persist in holding companies which don't make the transition of facing a lot of financial risk, simply because there is no future. Indeed, as Mark Carney said, there is no future for companies that don't make the transition.
You're right, and I think this is one of the things that made me sort of break out into a cold sweat as I read some of the research on your website, is that you don't have to necessarily believe in climate change. All you have to have already started to believe in is passive investments. You probably have exposure in your passive investments to a pile of these companies with this risk. Well, I think it might be interesting to leave it there, and a good place for me to just give off a couple of names here. So on Carbon Tracker Initiative's website, carbontracker.org, do check out The Speed of the Energy Transition. It was published back in September. That was one of the ones that made me go cold sweat. And and last week, or I should say 2 weeks ago, Land of the Rising Sun and Offshore Wind. Do check those out. We'll have them all linked in the show notes. But Kingsmill Mark, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
I hope you enjoyed our podcast. If you have not yet, please subscribe at the podcast app of your choice. Also, please visit us on the web at cfany.org.